Sometimes the hardest thing in life is doing the right thing for the wrong person. Sometimes mercy and justice can't live in the same heart. Sennie Darrow had lost her younger brother Beau 3 years back, shot down in cold blood near Dry Ridge. Nobody ever paid for it. She lived alone now in the mountains east of Fort Bridger, her cabin buried in snow most of the year. When she found a dying man beside his broken wagon in a blizzard, she pulled him inside and saved his life. His name was Rhain Tollis, but as the storm kept them trapped together, she started noticing things. The way he went quiet when she spoke her family name, the look in his eyes. Then she found something in his coat pocket that changed everything. What do you do when you realize you just saved your brother's killer? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter wind came down from the peaks like something alive, howling through the pine stands and rattling the shutters of Sennie Darrow's cabin. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the sky darken to the color of old pewter, another storm building. She could read weather the way some folks read books, and this one promised to be fierce. She was 42 years old, though the mountains had aged her beyond those years. Her hands were calloused from axe work, and her face had been carved lean by wind and solitude. Her hair, once the color of chestnuts, now carried threads of silver she never bothered to hide. There was no one out here to see it anyway, and vanity had died in her the same winter her brother did. The cabin sat in a clearing 6 miles east of Fort Bridger, nestled against the shoulder of a mountain whose name the trappers had long forgotten. It was a solid structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, walls chinked tight against the cold. Her father had built it 30 years back, when he'd brought his young family west to try his hand at timber. That hadn't worked out. Neither had much else except survival. Her mother had died of fever when Sennie was 12. Her father followed 6 years later, his heart giving out during a late spring snowstorm while checking his trap lines. That left just Sennie and Beau. She'd been 18 then, him barely 15. They'd made it work. She learned to hunt and trap, to cure meat and stretch hides. Beau learned carpentry and helped with the heavy work. They weren't rich, but they got by. The mountain provided if you knew how to ask and weren't afraid of hard work. Then the war came. Beau was 21 when he enlisted, full of idealism and the kind of restless energy young men carry when they're desperate to prove themselves. Sennie had tried to talk him out of it. The war didn't concern them, she'd said. Let the politicians and the plantation owners settle their own quarrels. But Beau had been adamant. He said it was about something bigger than them, about the kind of country they wanted to live in. He'd been gone 3 years. Came back different, quieter, harder-eyed, with a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder. He'd seen things he wouldn't talk about, done things that woke him screaming in the night. But underneath the scars, he was still Beau, still had that crooked smile that came slow but warm, still called her Sen in that affectionate way that made her feel less alone. He'd only been home 2 months when it happened. Said he had to make one more trip, something to do with settling accounts from his service. He'd seemed worried but determined. Told her not to fret, that he'd be back in 2 weeks. Gave her that crooked smile and ruffled her hair like she was still a girl. She never saw him alive again. Sheriff Talbot had ridden up 3 weeks later, his face grave. Found Beau and 2 other men shot dead near Dry Ridge, he'd said. Ambush looked like. Professional work. No witnesses, no tracks worth following after the snow. The other 2 men were former soldiers too, friends of Beau's from the war. Their belongings had been rifled through, but nothing valuable taken. Made no sense, the sheriff said. Probably drifters or deserters looking for trouble, but Sennie knew better. Beau had been killed for a reason, and that reason had died with him. The sheriff had offered his sympathies and ridden away, and that was the end of it. No investigation, no justice, no answers. Just 3 men dead and buried, and a sister left to wonder. She'd buried Beau next to their parents in the small plot behind the cabin, carved his marker herself from a piece of good pine. The letters had blurred with weather now, but she knew what they said. Beau and Darrow, 1844-1865, gone but not forgotten. She visited the grave every Sunday, regardless of weather, brought wildflowers in summer, pine boughs in winter, talked to him sometimes, though she didn't believe he could hear. It just felt right to speak the words aloud. The years after Beau's death had been the hardest. The loneliness settled on her like a physical weight. She considered leaving, selling the cabin, moving somewhere with people and noise and distraction. But every time she got close to deciding, she'd remember Beau's crooked smile or hear his laugh in the wind through the pines, and she'd stay. This was their place, the last piece of family she had left, so she'd built a life from routine and necessity. Up before dawn to tend the fire. Coffee and salt pork for breakfast. Check the traplines in the morning, chop wood in the afternoon. Evenings were for mending, for reading the few books she owned by firelight, for sitting with her thoughts and the silence. Once a month, she'd make the trip into Fort Bridger for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, lamp oil. The storekeep knew her, greeted her kindly, never asked questions. The other townspeople kept their distance. They called her the Darrow woman and spoke of her with a mixture of respect and wariness. A woman alone in the mountains was either crazy or dangerous, and folks couldn't decide which she was. Truth was, she was neither. She was just someone who'd lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything else, even if that meant having nothing left to lose. The cabin held memories in every corner. The chair by the fireplace where her father used to sit, whittling and telling stories. The shelf her mother had insisted on, even though they had so few books to fill it. Beau's old bunk in the corner, still made up with the quilt their mother had sewn. Sennie couldn't bring herself to dismantle it. On the mantel above the fireplace sat Beau's pocket watch. Tarnished silver, the crystal cracked, the hands frozen at 3:47. That was the time he'd died, according to the sheriff. A bullet had struck the watch in his vest pocket, stopped it cold. The watch had been returned to her, along with his other effects. She kept it there as a reminder. Of Beau, of the time that had stopped for him, but kept grinding forward for her. Of justice unserved. She'd long since stopped expecting answers about who killed Beau or why. The trail had gone cold within days, and 3 years was a lifetime in frontier territory. Men disappeared, changed names, moved on. Whoever had killed her brother was probably long gone, living some other life untroubled by what they'd done. That was how the world worked. The guilty often walked free while the innocent bled into the dirt, but she'd never forgotten, and she'd never forgiven. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the first flakes of snow against the window glass. Sennie watched them swirl and dance, thinking about her traplines. She'd need to check the North Pass before the storm hit full force. It was a hard trek, 2 hours up through steep timber, but one of her best sets was up there, and she couldn't afford to lose any pelts to scavengers or weather. She pulled on her heaviest coat, the one lined with beaver fur, wrapped a wool scarf around her neck, tugged on her gloves and her father's old hat, shouldered her rifle and her pack. The wind hit her like a wall when she opened the door, but she pushed through it, leaning into the slope. Her boots crunching through the crust of old snow. The forest was eerily quiet, the way it got before a big storm. Even the jays had gone silent. Sennie moved through it with practiced ease, reading the land without conscious thought. A week-old elk track here, a torn patch of bark where a buck had rubbed his antlers there. The familiar landmarks passed, the lightning-split pine, the boulder shaped like a sitting bear, the frozen creek where she'd once seen a wolf drink. She was thinking about supper, about whether she had enough salt pork left, or if she'd need to open one of her canned goods. When she rounded a bend and saw the wagon, it was overturned in a snowdrift. One wheel shattered, supplies scattered across the ground, and next to it, barely visible in the gathering snow, lay a man. Sennie stopped, her hand moving instinctively to her rifle. Could be a trap. Could be bandits using a false victim to draw in the unwary. But as she watched, the man stirred, his arm moving weakly, and she heard a sound that was half moan, half prayer. She approached carefully, rifle ready, scanning the trees for movement. But there was nothing, just the man, the wagon, and the rising storm. Up close, she could see he was in bad shape. His coat was torn, dark with blood. His face was pale, his lips blue with cold. Frost clung to his beard and eyebrows. He wasn't conscious, not really. Just making those small, involuntary movements of a body, trying desperately to survive. Sennie knelt beside him, checking for weapons first. Found a revolver in his belt, pocketed it. Then she examined his injuries. Bullet wound in his left shoulder, not bleeding much now, but serious. Frostbite on his hands and face. Likely hypothermia setting in. If she left him here, he'd be dead by morning. Possibly sooner. She should leave him. That was the smart play. Winter in the mountains was hard enough without taking on the burden of a stranger. And strangers meant complications, meant questions, meant the outside world intruding on her carefully constructed solitude. Besides, she didn't owe this man anything, didn't even know him, but even as she thought it, she was already making her decision. Whatever else she'd become in these years alone, she wasn't someone who could walk away from a dying man. Her mother had raised her better than that. Bo would have stopped to help. She bent and grabbed the man under his arms, grunting with effort. He was heavy, dead weight, and the snow made everything harder. It took her almost an hour to drag him back to the cabin, stopping every few yards to catch her breath, her shoulders burning with effort. The storm intensified around them, the snow coming down thick and fast, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as she made them. By the time she got him inside, she was exhausted and soaked with sweat despite the cold. She laid him on the floor by the fire and set to work. Built up the flames until heat filled the room. Cut away his coat and shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, which was lucky. She cleaned it with whiskey, packed it with clean cloth, bound it tight. Then she stripped off his wet clothes, wrapped him in blankets, and put him in Bo's old bunk. Only then, as she was hanging his coat to dry, did she find the cavalry insignia. It fell out of an inside pocket, landing on the floor with a dull clink. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. 2nd Colorado Cavalry, the same unit that had been stationed near Dry Ridge in 1865. Sennie stood very still, the insignia cold in her palm. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the stranger breathed softly, unconscious and oblivious. And on the mantel, Bo's broken watch marked the moment time had stopped. She looked at the stranger's face, peaceful in unconsciousness, and wondered who he was, what he'd done, where he'd been, and whether, when he woke, she'd regret saving his life. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. Snow piled against the cabin walls until Sennie had to dig a path just to reach the woodshed. The wind came in waves, shaking the sturdy building and sending snow down the chimney to hiss in the fire. It was the kind of storm that old-timers talked about for years after, the kind that killed livestock and unwary travelers. The stranger drifted in and out of consciousness, fever-hot 1 hour and shaking with chills the next. Sennie tended him with the same efficiency she applied to everything, checking his wound, forcing water between his lips, keeping him warm. She didn't do it out of kindness exactly, more out of stubborn determination, not to have dragged a dying man through a blizzard, only to have him expire in her cabin. But she watched him carefully, and that cavalry insignia stayed in her pocket, a cold weight against her hip. On the second night, his fever broke. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her coat when she heard him stir. His breathing changed, became more conscious. She set down her needle and walked to the bunk, staying just out of reach. His eyes opened, grey, like winter sky. They were unfocused at first, then sharpened as awareness returned. He looked at the ceiling, then at the cabin walls, then finally at her. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His throat was too dry. Sennie fetched water, held the cup while he drank. He managed a few swallows before falling back against the pillow, exhausted from even that small effort. "Where?" he managed, his voice barely a rasp. "My cabin, 6 miles east of Fort Bridger. I found you by your wagon 3 days back. Storm's been going strong since." He processed this slowly, his eyes closing. For a moment she thought he'd passed out again, but then he spoke. "Thank you." She didn't respond to that. Instead she asked, "What's your name?" Another long pause. Rhain Tollis. "What were you doing out there, Rhain Tollis?" "Heading to Fort Bridger. Surveyor work." He opened his eyes again, studying her. "You? This is my home. I live here, alone." "That's not your concern." He had the sense to let it drop. His gaze moved around the cabin, taking in details. She saw him notice the rifle propped near the door, the knives on the table, the general air of sparse functionality. When his eyes landed on Beau's pocket watch on the mantel, they lingered there a moment too long. "How bad am I?" he asked. "You took a bullet through your shoulder. Frostbite on your hands. You'll live if you rest and don't do anything foolish. The bullet through and through." I cleaned it best I could. "You were lucky." He gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "Don't feel lucky. You're alive. That's more than many can say in weather like this." He settled back into the pillow, his energy clearly spent. Within minutes, he was asleep again, his breathing deep and steady. Sennie returned to her mending, but her mind was elsewhere. That night, after she was certain he was deep in sleep, she went through his belongings. His pack had been on the wagon, and she'd brought it in along with what supplies she could salvage. Most of it was ordinary enough. Spare clothes, ammunition, a worn Bible, a few letters addressed to him at various locations. But tucked in the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a map. She unfolded it carefully by lamplight. It was hand-drawn, showing the territory around Fort Bridger in careful detail. Several locations were marked. Some she recognized as settlements or way stations. But one mark made her breath catch. A small X circled in red ink, with one word written beside it, Dry Ridge, and in the margin in the same careful hand were notes. Supply route. 3 riders. January 12th, 1865. The date Beau died. Sennie's hands trembled as she refolded the map. She looked at the sleeping stranger, Rhain Tollis, if that was even his real name, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She spent the rest of the night sitting in her chair with her rifle across her lap, watching him breathe. Part of her wanted to wake him, demand answers. Another part wanted to put a bullet through him and be done with it. But she did neither. She just watched and waited, turning over possibilities in her mind. By morning she'd made her decision. She would let him heal. She would keep him alive. And she would find out exactly who Rhain Tollis was and what he'd been doing at Dry Ridge 3 years ago. Over the next 2 days, as the storm finally began to ease, she tested him with careful questions. Where was he from? Colorado originally, he said. Served in the war, cavalry unit stationed mostly in the territories. After the war he'd drifted, tried his hand at different work. Surveying seemed as good as anything. His story was plausible enough. But there were gaps, moments when he hesitated, when his eyes shifted away. When she asked which unit he'd served with, he mentioned the 2nd Colorado, but changed the subject quickly. When she asked about his work, he was vague about details, and whenever she mentioned her family name, "I'm Sennie Darrow, by the way," she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. On the 4th day, he was strong enough to sit up, though he moved gingerly, favoring his wounded shoulder. She made coffee, and they sat across from each other at her small table, the silence heavy between them. "Storms breaking," she said. "Snow's too deep to travel yet, but give it a week and the passes should be manageable." He nodded. "I'm grateful for what you've done. When I'm able, I'll work to repay you. Chop wood, whatever you need. That won't be necessary, I insist. It's the least I can do." She studied him over the rim of her cup. He looked better, color returning to his face, steadiness to his hands. He was probably in his mid-30s, though hard living had aged him, like it aged everyone out here. There were scars on his hands and arms, the kind that came from fights and hard work. His eyes held a wariness that spoke of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. In another life, she might have found him handsome. In this one, she just found him suspicious. "Tell me about Dry Ridge," she said suddenly. He froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What? Dry Ridge? You know the place?" A long pause, too long. "I've heard of it." "Why? Just wondering. Some bad things happened there a few years back. 3 men killed. Thought maybe you'd heard about it." His face had gone carefully neutral. "Can't say I did." She stood up, walked to where his pack lay in the corner, pulled out the map and unfolded it on the table between them. "Pointed to the red X, then why is it marked on your map? With the date and everything?" Rhain Tollis looked at the map, then at her, and something shifted in his expression. The wariness deepened, but underneath it, she saw something else. Resignation, maybe, or recognition that a reckoning had finally come. Who were they? He asked quietly. The 3 men who died. One of them was my brother. Darrow. He closed his eyes, and she saw his jaw tighten. When he opened them again, they held a sorrow so deep it almost made her falter. Then I expect, he said, his voice steady despite everything, that you have questions for me. Outside, the wind had finally died. The storm was over. But inside the cabin, Sennie felt as though another one was just beginning. But Rhain didn't answer her questions that morning. Instead, he looked at her with those grey eyes and said, I'll tell you everything, but not today. Today I'm too weak to do the story justice, and you deserve the whole truth. Sennie wanted to push, wanted to demand answers right then, but something in his face stopped her. There was no deception there now, no evasion, just a bone-deep weariness that she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror. Tomorrow then, she said, tomorrow. They spent that day in careful silence. Rhain sat by the fire, regaining his strength. Sennie went about her routine, checking supplies, mending gear, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in white stillness. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin walls. That evening, as she prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork, Rhain spoke. Your brother, what was he like? She almost didn't answer, but something about the way he asked, genuine, not probing, made her set down her spoon and turn to face him. He was kind, she said finally. Too kind for this world, probably. Always saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. She paused, remembering. He had this crooked smile that came slow but lit up his whole face when it arrived. And he laughed easy. That was what I missed most after he died. The sound of someone laughing in this cabin. Rhain nodded slowly. He was young? 21. Just back from the war. Had his whole life ahead of him. I'm sorry. She turned back to the stove. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't bring him back. They ate in silence after that. When the meal was done, Sennie took her usual place in the chair by the fire, while Rhain settled back on the bunk. The lamplight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. You live here alone, Rhain said. It wasn't quite a question. I do. That's hard. Especially in winter. I manage. I'm sure you do. He shifted, wincing at the movement. But it's still hard, she didn't respond. Wasn't sure how to. The truth was, it was hard. Harder than she'd ever admit out loud. But what was the alternative? Move to town, take in sewing or washing, live as the spinster sister of a murdered man. At least here she had her dignity. Her independence. Her memories. How long have you been searching? She asked suddenly. He looked at her, understanding immediately what she meant. 3 years. Since it happened. Searching for what? For you. For Beau's family. To make things right, if that's possible. And how did you plan to do that? He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I still don't know. But I had to try. She studied him in the firelight. He looked sincere, but then again, so did most liars, until you caught them at it. Why? That's part of the story I owe you tomorrow. She nodded, accepting that. They sat in the dimming light, 2 people bound together by tragedy and circumstance, neither quite sure what to do with the other. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sennie rose before first light, as always, and found Rhain already awake. He'd made coffee, or tried to. It was weak and bitter, but the gesture was there. Today, she asked. Today? They sat at the table, the weak winter sun filtering through the window. Outside, the world was painfully bright, sunlight reflecting off endless snow. Inside, shadows gathered in the corners. Rhain wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and began. I was at Dry Ridge that day. January 12th, 1865. I was part of a unit ordered to intercept a supply run. We didn't know who we were intercepting or why, just that our commanding officer said it needed to be done, and it needed to be done quietly. Sennie's hands tightened on her own cup, but she said nothing. There were 3 of us positioned in the rocks above the trail. I was the sharpshooter. The others were support. We waited hours in the cold. Then we saw 3 riders coming up the trail, moving careful-like, watching their surroundings. They knew they might be walking into trouble, He paused, took a breath. I was given the order to fire. I'm not going to make excuses. I could have refused. Maybe I should have. But I was a soldier and I followed orders. I fired 3 shots. Clean, quick. All 3 men went down. Sennie felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd known, of course. Had suspected since she found the map. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. Final. After, Rhain continued, we went down to search the bodies. That's when I found the papers on your brother. Letters, a journal. Enough to realize we hadn't stopped some supply run. We'd executed 3 men who were trying to expose corruption within our own command. He looked up at her, and she saw the weight of it in his eyes. Your brother was a hero, Miss Darrow. He and the other 2 men, Corporal Hayes and Private Dunmore, they'd discovered that our commanding officer and several others were stealing army supplies and selling them. Medicine, food, ammunition, things soldiers needed. Men were dying because of it, and your brother couldn't stand by. Sennie's throat felt tight. So you killed him to keep him quiet. I killed him because I didn't know what he was trying to do. If I'd known... He stopped, shook his head. But I didn't know. And that's not an excuse, just a fact. Who gave the order? Colonel Everett Gaines. He's a territorial judge now, living comfortable in Cheyenne. Powerful, connected, untouchable. She absorbed this, piece by piece. And the others? The men who were with you? One died in a later skirmish. The other deserted, disappeared. I tried to find him to get him to testify, but he's gone. It's just me now. Just you, she echoed. The man who killed my brother. Yes. She stood abruptly, walked to the window. Outside, the snow sparkled innocently in the sun. Beautiful and cold and indifferent to human suffering. Why did you come looking for me? She asked without turning around. Because I couldn't live with it. With what I'd done. I left the army, spent 3 years trying to find Beau's family. To tell you the truth. To face whatever justice you saw fit. She turned to face him. And what justice would that be? Should I shoot you? Turn you over to the law? What good would any of it do? I don't know, he said simply. That's for you to decide. I won't fight whatever you choose. They stood there, across the small cabin from each other, the truth finally laid bare between them. Sennie felt a storm of emotions, rage, grief, confusion, but underneath it all, a strange, unwelcome understanding. He'd killed Beau, but he hadn't done it out of malice or greed. He'd done it following orders he didn't understand, and he'd been trying to make amends ever since. It didn't make it right. Nothing could make it right. But it complicated her anger in ways she hadn't expected. I need time, she said finally, to think about this. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and that at least was true. The snow was still too deep for travel, and he was still too weak. They were trapped here together, bound by weather and circumstance, and the ghost of a young man who died trying to do the right thing. The days that followed were strange. They moved around each other carefully, like 2 animals sharing a den, out of necessity rather than choice. Sennie went about her routines, and Rhain, growing stronger, tried to make himself useful despite her protests. On the 5th day after his confession, she came in from checking what traplines she could reach to find him attempting to chop wood. He managed 3 swings before she took the axe from him. You'll tear that wound open, she said curtly. I can't just sit here useless. You're healing. That's not useless. She split the log he'd been working on with 1 clean stroke. Besides, I've been doing this alone for 3 years. I don't need help. I know you don't need it, but maybe I need to give it. She looked at him, at the determination in his face, and softened slightly. Fine, you can split kindling. Small pieces. Nothing that requires serious effort. He nodded, accepting the compromise. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of splitting wood sharp in the cold air. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only came in deep winter, so bright it almost hurt to look at. Tell me about after, Sennie said suddenly. After Dry Ridge, what happened? Rhain set down the small axe he'd been using. I couldn't let it go. Started asking questions quietly. Tried to find evidence of what Gaines was doing. But he's smart, and he had the whole command structure protecting him. Men who were in on it or who just didn't want to rock the boat. You tried to turn him in. I tried. Went to a major I thought I could trust. He listened, then told me to let it go. Said I didn't have proof, and accusations like that could end my career, or worse. He rubbed his shoulder absently. A week later, I was assigned to a patrol that ran into an ambush. Took this bullet. Spent 2 months recovering, and when I came back, the major had been transferred and my unit was disbanded. They tried to kill you. Maybe. Or maybe it was just bad luck. Hard to say. He picked up another piece of wood. Either way, I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere from inside the army. So I left, took my discharge, and started looking for the families of the men who died. To tell them the truth. Sennie felt something twist in her chest. Did you find the others? Hayes's family had moved east. Never could track them down. Dunmore's mother had died while he was at war. He had no one else. He met her eyes. You were the only one left to tell. And you spent 3 years searching for me. It wasn't hard to find out Bo had a sister. But finding where you'd gone, that took time. People around Fort Bridger knew the Darrow family, but most thought you'd left after Bo died. It wasn't until this winter that someone mentioned seeing smoke from your cabin. She processed this, splitting another log. The physical work helped, gave her hands something to do while her mind churned. Why bring the map? Why keep evidence of what you did? Because I knew if I ever found you, I'd need proof. Otherwise it would just be words, and words don't mean much in this territory. That was true enough. She'd learned that the hard way, when the sheriff had shrugged off Bo's death as just another frontier tragedy. They went back inside when the cold became too much. Sennie made coffee, and they sat at the table, an arrangement that was becoming routine. She found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the man before her with the killer she'd imagined for 3 years. He wasn't what she'd expected. She'd pictured someone cruel, someone who killed without remorse. But Rhain carried his guilt like a physical weight. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes, the way he sometimes stared at nothing with an expression of profound regret. "What did you think would happen when you found me?" she asked. He considered the question. "Honestly, I thought you'd kill me, or turn me over to the law. Either way, I'd face consequences for what I did. That seemed right. And now? Now I don't know. You saved my life when you could have left me to freeze. That's not something I expected from the sister of a man I killed." Sennie wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling its warmth. "I didn't know who you were when I found you. If I had—" She stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. Would she have left him? She wanted to say yes, but she wasn't certain. Her mother's voice still echoed in her head, lessons about mercy and doing right even when it was hard. "You would have saved me anyway," Rhain said quietly. "Because that's who you are." It's probably who Bo was too. That kind of decency runs in families. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she changed the subject. "This Colonel Gaines, he's still out there living free." He is. Grew richer off what he stole, used his connections to become a judge. Men like him always land on their feet. The bitterness in his voice matched what she felt. 3 years of wondering who had killed Bo, and now she knew. But the man responsible was beyond her reach, protected by power and position. Does he know you're looking for him? I've been careful, but he's not stupid. He probably suspects someone might come for him eventually. Rhain's jaw tightened. The men he had with him that day are scattered now. Some dead, some gone. Without their testimony, it's my word against his. And my word isn't worth much against a territorial judge. They sat with that reality between them. Justice felt like a distant dream, something for other people in other places. Out here, the strong took what they wanted, and the weak made do with what was left. That night, as they prepared for sleep, her in her chair, him in Bo's bunk, Sennie found herself watching the pocket watch on the mantel. Frozen at 3:47, the moment Bo's time had run out. She'd kept it there as a reminder, a memorial. But now it felt like something else. Like she'd been frozen too, stopped in that moment of grief and unable to move forward. "Tell me something good about him," Rhain said from the bunk. "About Bo, something that made him who he was." She was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. But then she spoke. "When we were children, maybe I was 10 and he was 7, there was a dog that showed up at our cabin. Half-starved, mean as anything. Had probably been abandoned by trappers. My father wanted to shoot it, said it would just cause trouble. But Bo begged him to give the dog a chance, spent weeks earning its trust. Left food out, spoke gentle, never pushed. Eventually, that dog became the most loyal creature you ever saw. Followed Bo everywhere. What happened to it? Died of old age year before the war. Bo buried it behind the cabin, carved a marker, cried like his heart was breaking. She smiled faintly at the memory. That was Bo. He saw the good in things even when no one else could. He believed people and animals deserved a chance to be better than their circumstances. He sounds like he was a fine man. He was. She paused. He would have forgiven you, I think. Eventually, that's the kind of person he was. But you can't. It wasn't a question. She considered lying, but what was the point? I don't know. Maybe someday. But not yet. That's fair. The fire crackled, shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, its cry lonely and wild. Sennie pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. Her mind kept turning over everything Rhain had told her, trying to fit it together with the grief she'd carried for 3 years. Bo had died a hero, trying to expose corruption. That was something, at least. Better than dying for nothing, which was what she'd believed all this time. But it didn't ease the ache of his absence, or the years of loneliness that had followed. And Rhain, what was she supposed to do with him? The easy answer would be to hate him, to see him punished. But nothing about this situation was easy. He'd killed Bo, yes, but he'd also spent 3 years trying to make amends, to bring some kind of justice to the situation. He was both guilty and remorseful, both her brother's killer and the only person who knew the truth of what had happened. The world, she was learning, was not as simple as she'd once believed. And that somehow made everything harder. A week after the storm ended, the sun came out strong, and the snow began its slow retreat. Not melting exactly, it was still too cold for that, but compacting, crusting over, becoming navigable. Sennie checked her traplines and found 2 frozen rabbits and a marten. Not a bad haul considering. Rhain was moving better now, his shoulder healing clean. He'd taken to doing small tasks around the cabin without asking permission. Stacking wood, mending a loose shutter hinge, organizing the supplies she'd salvaged from his wagon. She let him. It was easier than arguing, and truthfully, the help was welcome even if she wouldn't admit it. One afternoon, she came back from checking the northern trail to find him going through his pack. He didn't try to hide what he was doing, just glanced up as she entered. "Looking for something?" she asked, stamping snow from her boots. Found something, actually. He held up a small photograph, edges worn from handling. "Thought you might want to see this." She crossed to him, curious despite herself. The photograph showed 3 men in uniform, standing in front of a distinctive rock formation. The image was faded but clear enough. On the back, written in pencil, "Dry Ridge Detail, 1865. Her breath caught. "Is that me?" "Yes. And the 2 others who were with me that day." He pointed to each figure. "That's Corporal Mitchell. He's the one who died later in action. And that's Private Keene. He's the one who deserted." Sennie studied the photograph, then turned it over to look at the rock formation again. She recognized it now, a distinctive outcropping shaped like a breaking wave, visible from the trail where Bo had died. She'd seen it herself, marked it in memory, as the place where her brother's blood had soaked into the frozen ground. "Why do you keep this?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Same reason you keep that watch." "To remember, to make sure I never forget what I did." She handed it back to him, but something else in his pack caught her eye. An envelope sealed with wax, yellowed with age. "What's that?" He followed her gaze, and his expression changed. Something between shame and resignation. "A letter I wrote 3 years ago, right after it happened, before I knew where to send it." "To who?" "To the family of Bo Darrow." He picked it up, held it carefully. "I wrote down everything. What happened, who gave the orders, why. Signed it, sealed it. Thought if I ever found his family, I could give them the truth in writing. Something official." Sennie stared at the envelope. "You've been carrying that for 3 years." "Couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Couldn't deliver it either until now." He held it out to her. "It's yours, if you want it." She took it slowly, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to carry so much truth. She turned it over in her hands, looking at the careful script on the front. To the family of Beau Darrow, the truth of what happened at Dry Ridge. I haven't opened it, she said. You don't have to. I've already told you everything that's in there. But sometimes words on paper carry more weight than spoken ones. Sometimes people need that proof. She set the letter on the table, not ready to break the seal yet. You really spent 3 years looking for me just to give me this? I spent 3 years looking for a way to make it right. This was all I could think to do. They stood in the quiet cabin, afternoon light slanting through the window. Outside, a raven called, its voice harsh in the stillness. I need to ask you something, Sennie said. And I need the truth, always. Did Gaines know who Beau was? Did he know what Beau had on him? Rhain's face darkened. He knew. We found that out after. The whole reason for the ambush was to stop Beau and the others from delivering their evidence to authorities at Fort Laramie. Gaines had gotten wind of their investigation somehow. Maybe someone talked, maybe he just got suspicious. Either way, he knew they were a threat and he eliminated them, so it wasn't just following orders. It was murder, assassination. Yes, Rhain's voice was flat, hard. Gaines gave the order knowing exactly what he was doing and why. The rest of us, we were just tools he used. That doesn't excuse it, no, it doesn't. He met her eyes steadily. I pulled the trigger. I'm responsible for that. But Gaines gave the order, and he's the one who should answer for it. Sennie walked to the window, looking out at the endless white landscape. Men like him never answer for anything. That's how the world works. Maybe, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to hold them accountable. She turned back to him. What could we possibly do? You said it yourself. He's powerful, connected. Your word against his wouldn't be worth anything. Not my word alone, no. But what if there was more? What if we could find the evidence Beau was carrying? The documents he and the others had gathered. The sheriff said their belongings were rifled through. Whoever killed them took everything valuable. But what if they didn't? What if Beau hid something just in case? He knew he was walking into danger. Maybe he took precautions. Sennie's heart skipped. He came here 3 weeks before he died. Stayed 2 nights. He was nervous, kept checking the windows, barely slept. Did he say what he was working on? No, just that he had business to finish, something important. I asked, but he said it was better I didn't know, safer. She pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to remember. He kept looking at the fireplace. I thought he was just cold, but maybe he was thinking about hiding something. They both looked at the stone fireplace at the same time. It was solid work, her father's craftsmanship, river rocks fitted together with careful precision. Sennie had grown up with it, knew every stone, or thought she did. Rhain stood slowly. May I? She nodded, unable to speak. He crossed to the fireplace and began examining it closely, running his hands over the stones, pressing gently to test for movement. Sennie watched, her pulse quickening. It took him 10 minutes to find it. A stone about waist-high, slightly smaller than the others, set just a bit differently. When he pressed it, it shifted inward with a soft grinding sound. Behind it was a hollow space, and in that space, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. Sennie's hands shook as she pulled it out. The oilcloth was intact, keeping the contents dry. She unwrapped it slowly, almost afraid of what she'd find. It was a journal. Beau's handwriting filled the pages, neat, careful entries dating back over a year. Names, dates, amounts, records of stolen supplies, routes used to transport them, buyers on the other end. Witness statements from soldiers who'd seen things they weren't supposed to see. And at the back, tucked into a pocket, official documents bearing signatures and seals. My God, Rhain breathed. He documented everything. Sennie's eyes filled with tears as she turned the pages. Here was Beau's voice, preserved in ink. His determination to do right, his careful gathering of evidence, his hope that he could make a difference. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. Meeting Hayes and Dunmore tomorrow at Dry Ridge. We have enough now. More than enough. After we deliver this to Major Kinsman at Fort Laramie, it's over. Gaines and his whole network will fall. Then I'm coming home to Sen. No more soldiering, no more danger. Just home. She couldn't read anymore. The tears came hot and fast, 3 years of grief finally breaking through. Rhain stepped back, giving her space, and she wept for her brother and his courage, and the future that had been stolen from him. When Sennie's tears finally stopped, she found Rhain sitting quietly at the table, giving her the dignity of her grief. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and sat down across from him, the journal between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. "He knew," she said, her voice rough. "He knew he might not make it. That's why he hid this here. He was protecting you, and protecting the evidence." Rhain looked at the journal with something like reverence. "He was a brave man, Miss Darrow. What he did, it took real courage." She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she opened the journal again, forcing herself to read through Beau's careful documentation. Page after page of theft, corruption, betrayal. Names she recognized. Officers who'd been decorated for their service. Men of standing and respect, all of them complicit in stealing from their own army, from soldiers who needed those supplies to survive. And at the center of it all, Colonel Everett Gaines. His signature appeared on dozens of documents, orders for supplies that never arrived, authorizations for shipments that went to private buyers instead of army posts. He hadn't even tried to hide it, confident that his position protected him. And it had. For years it had. "This is enough," Rhain said, reading over her shoulder. "This would bring him down. Bring all of them down, would it? How do we even get this to someone who'll listen?" The old bitterness crept back into her voice. "The sheriff didn't care when 3 men died. Why would anyone care about old theft charges? Because this isn't just theft. It's treason in wartime. Men died because they didn't have medicine, ammunition, food, things that were stolen and sold. That's murder, Miss Darrow. And the army doesn't take kindly to murder, even when it's done by officers." She wanted to believe him, but 3 years of grief had taught her that justice was rare and mercy even rarer. Who would we take it to? Major Kinsman at Fort Laramie. That's who Beau was planning to give it to. From what I heard, Kinsman is honest. One of the few who can't be bought. You know him. I know of him. Never served under him, but his reputation is solid. If anyone would act on this, it would be him. Sennie closed the journal carefully, running her hand over its worn cover. Fort Laramie is 3 weeks' travel in good weather. In winter, 6 weeks, maybe more. Rhain's expression was grim. And Gaines has people everywhere. If he gets word that we're moving, he'll send men to stop us. He doesn't know the journal exists. No, but he knows I do. And if he finds out I'm alive, he'll put the pieces together fast enough. They sat with that reality. Outside, the short winter day was fading, shadows lengthening across the snow. A cold wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the pines. "We could wait," Sennie said, "until spring. Travel would be easier, and give Gaines more time to consolidate his position. He's a territorial judge now. By spring, he might be something even more untouchable." Rhain shook his head. "No, if we're going to do this, we need to move while we still can." "We?" She looked at him sharply. "You think I'm taking you with me? You can't do this alone. You'd need someone who knows the back trails, who can watch your back, who killed my brother." The words came out harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. "You think I'd trust you with this? With Beau's life work?" Rhain absorbed the blow without flinching. "No, I don't think you trust me. But you need me. You know these mountains, but I know the territory between here and Fort Laramie. I know where Gaines might have men posted, which routes are being watched. And more than that, Major Kinsman will need someone to testify, someone who was there, who can confirm what's in that journal. Your testimony isn't worth anything. You said so yourself. Not by itself, no. But with this journal, with Beau's evidence, with documents bearing Gaines's signature, my testimony becomes the piece that connects it all. I can tell them what the orders were, how we were positioned, what happened after. I can give them the whole picture. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him to leave, to let her handle this alone, the way she'd handled everything else for the past 3 years. But he was right, damn him. She needed his knowledge of the territory, his military experience, his testimony. And more than that, she needed someone who understood what Beau had been trying to do, who cared about seeing it finished. "If we do this," she said slowly, And I'm not saying we will, but if we do, there are rules. Name them. You do exactly what I say when I say it. No arguments, no debates. In these mountains, hesitation gets you killed. Agreed. And if we run into trouble, if it looks like we might not make it, you make sure the journal gets to Fort Laramie, even if I don't. Beau's evidence matters more than either of us. I'll do everything I can to make sure we both make it. But yes, the journal reaches kinsman no matter what. She studied his face in the dimming light, looking for deception or false promises. But all she saw was determination and that bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been carrying guilt for too long. There's one more thing, she said.
I need to know why.
Not why you killed Beau, you've explained that. But why you're really doing this. You could have stayed away, kept your head down, lived your life. Why chase justice for a man you killed? Rhain was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost painful to hear. Because I see his face every night when I close my eyes. I see him falling, see the surprise, and then the nothing as life leaves him. And I know that he died trying to do something good, something right, while I was being used as a tool for evil. I can't bring him back. Can't undo what I did. But maybe if I help finish what he started, if I help bring down the man who ordered his death, maybe I can sleep one night without seeing his face. You think that will give you peace? No, I don't think I deserve peace. But maybe it'll give me something to live with. And maybe it'll give your brother the justice he earned. Sennie looked at the journal, then at Beau's pocket watch on the mantel. Its hands forever frozen at 3:47. 3 years she'd lived with that stopped time, that frozen moment of grief. Maybe it was time to let the clock start moving again. We leave in 3 days, she said. That gives you time to heal and me time to prepare. We'll need supplies, cold weather gear, weapons. And we'll need to make copies of the most important pages in case something happens to the journal. Smart. I've survived 3 winters alone in these mountains. I didn't do it by being foolish. She stood, decision made. And Rhain, if you betray me, if this is some elaborate trick to get that journal for gains, I will put a bullet through you without a second thought. He met her eyes steadily. If I betray you, I'll deserve it. But I won't. I swear on everything I am, on my own soul, if I still have one, I won't betray you. She nodded once, accepting his oath. Then she lit the lamp against the gathering dark and began making plans. They had 3 days to prepare for a journey that would either bring justice to a corrupt judge or get them both killed. Either way, Beau's story would finally be told. The next 3 days passed in focused preparation. Sennie had lived in the mountains long enough to know that winter travel required careful planning and that mistakes could be fatal. She went through her supplies, sorting what they'd need from what they could leave behind. Dried meat, flour, coffee, ammunition, extra blankets, rope, matches sealed in wax. She checked and rechecked their gear, making sure nothing would fail them on the trail. Rhain worked alongside her, his movements still careful, but growing stronger. He had survival skills of his own from his years in the cavalry, and she found herself grudgingly appreciative of his competence. He knew how to pack efficiently, how to distribute weight, how to prepare for emergencies. They worked mostly in silence, the enormity of what they were attempting hanging unspoken between them. On the second evening, as they sat copying key pages from Beau's journal by lamplight, Rhain spoke. I've been thinking about our route. The main trail to Fort Laramie will be watched. Gaines is paranoid. He'll have men at key points just in case. There are other ways. Harder, longer, but less traveled. That's what I was thinking. We avoid settlements. Avoid anywhere Gaines might have connections. Move through the back country. Sennie nodded, studying the map she'd spread on the table. She traced possible routes with her finger, considering options. We could go north first, then cut east through the high passes. It adds a week, but we'd be well away from any regular traffic. And in that country, anyone we meet would stand out. Easier to spot trouble coming? They continued planning, their heads bent close over the map. At some point, Sennie realized she'd stopped thinking of him as her brother's killer and started thinking of him as... what? Partner seemed too strong. Companion, maybe. Someone sharing a difficult journey toward a common goal. The realization unsettled her. She didn't want to feel anything toward Rhain Tollis except anger. Anger was clean, simple, righteous. But the truth was more complicated. He'd done a terrible thing, but he was trying to make it right. He'd killed Bo, but he'd also spent 3 years searching for a way to honor Bo's mission. Could both things be true at once? Could she hold both anger and understanding in her heart? She didn't know, and she was too tired to figure it out. On the third morning, they were nearly ready. Their packs stood by the door, supplies carefully distributed. Sennie had hidden the original journal in a metal box wrapped in oilcloth and buried it beneath the floorboards under her bed. The copies they'd made were split between their 2 packs, so if one was lost or destroyed, the other would survive. She was checking her rifle when Rhain spoke from across the cabin. "Miss Darrow, Sennie, there's something else you should see." She looked up. He was holding another envelope, this one unsealed, with what looked like official army documents inside. "What is it?" "Orders. The actual orders Gaines gave for the Dry Ridge ambush." He spread them on the table. "I kept them. Stole them from the command tent the night after it happened. I knew even then that something wasn't right, that I might need proof of what I'd been ordered to do." Sennie crossed to the table, her heart pounding. The documents were genuine. She could tell from the seals, the signatures, the official formatting. And there, in clear black ink, was Gaines's signature authorizing lethal force if necessary to secure sensitive materials, and no witnesses. This is, she couldn't find words. This proves he knew, proves he ordered murder. I know. I've been carrying these for 3 years, not sure what to do with them. Afraid to use them, afraid to destroy them. But now, combined with Bo's journal, this is everything we need. She stared at the documents, then at Rhain. "Why didn't you tell me about these before?" "Because I wasn't sure you'd believe they were real. Wasn't sure you wouldn't think I'd forged them somehow. But now that you found Bo's journal, now that you know I'm telling the truth, I wanted you to have these too." Sennie carefully folded the documents and added them to the copies in her pack. They had enough now. More than enough. Bo's meticulous documentation, Gaines' signed orders, Rhain's testimony. It was everything they needed to bring down a corrupt judge and expose a network of theft and murder that stretched back years. "We should leave at first light," she said. "The weather's been holding, but that won't last forever." Rhain nodded. They spent the rest of the day in final preparations, each lost in their own thoughts. As evening fell, Sennie made a simple supper, and they ate in companionable silence. It struck her how strange this was, sitting across from the man who'd killed her brother, planning to honor Bo's memory together. Life had a way of twisting into shapes you never expected. After supper, she walked to the small graveyard behind the cabin. The snow was deep, but she'd kept a path cleared. She stood before Bo's marker, her breath misting in the cold air. "I found it," she said softly. "The journal you hid, everything you worked for, everything you risked. It wasn't for nothing, Bo. I'm going to finish what you started. I promise you that." The wind whispered through the pines, the only answer she'd ever get. She stood there a while longer, remembering her brother's crooked smile, his easy laugh, his determination to do right even when it was hard. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin. Rhain was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the darkening sky. He glanced at her, then back out at the night. "I went out there once," he said. "To where Bo is buried. Last month, before the big storm. I didn't know you were here. Thought the cabin was abandoned. I just wanted to pay my respects, tell him I was sorry." "What did you say?" "That I was a coward and a fool. That I'd killed a better man than me. That I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it mean something." He was quiet a moment. "Then I heard someone coming, you, probably, and I left. 2 weeks later the storm hit and I ended up back here anyway." Sennie absorbed this. "He was buried with his knife, the one my father made for him. It was important to Bo, so I made sure he had it. That was kind of you. It wasn't kindness. It was," she struggled for words, "it was making sure he had something of home with him. Something that mattered." They stood in silence as full dark settled over the mountains. Tomorrow they would leave this place, this sanctuary of memory and grief, and venture into danger. They might not come back, Gaines had already killed 3 men to protect his secrets. He wouldn't hesitate to kill 2 more. But for the first time in 3 years, Sennie felt something other than grief. Purpose, maybe, or hope. The sense that Beau's death might finally mean something, might finally lead to justice. She went to the mantel and picked up Beau's pocket watch. The hand still read 3:47, forever frozen in that moment. She'd kept it stopped as a memorial, as a reminder. But Beau wouldn't have wanted time to stop. He'd have wanted her to keep living, keep moving forward. On impulse, she wound the watch. The mechanism resisted at first. 3 years was a long time to sit unused, but then it caught. She heard the familiar tick, steady and sure. The hands began to move, finally leaving 3:47 behind. Rhain watched but said nothing. She set the watch back on the mantel, now running, marking time instead of mourning it. Tomorrow, she said. First light? First light, he agreed. They prepared for sleep, her in the chair as always, him in Beau's bunk. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Tomorrow they would set out to finish what Beau had started, to bring justice to men who thought themselves above it, and whatever happened, whatever the cost, she would make sure her brother's courage and sacrifice weren't forgotten. She would make sure his story was told. They left at dawn, the sky a pale wash of color above the mountains. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each exhalation a white plume that hung in the stillness. Sennie took one last look at her cabin, her sanctuary for 3 years, and wondered if she'd ever see it again. Then she shouldered her pack and started walking. Rhain followed, moving well despite his healing wound. They'd agreed on silence for the first hours, saving their energy for the hard climb ahead. The snow was deep, but crusted enough to support their weight, and they made steady progress through the timber. By midday, they'd covered 6 miles, reaching the high pass Sennie had marked on their route. From here, they could see the territory stretching before them, ridge after ridge of mountains, valleys filled with snow, and beyond that, somewhere in the vast distance, Fort Laramie. They rested briefly, eating cold meat and hardtack. Rhain studied the landscape with a soldier's eye, noting landmarks and possible danger points. Anyone following us would be visible for miles up here, he observed. That works both ways. We'll be visible too. True. But at least we'll see them coming. They pushed on, dropping into the valley on the far side of the pass. The terrain here was rougher, the trees closer together. Sennie led them along a route she'd scouted years before, when she'd still trapped in this region. It was hard going, but it kept them off the main trails and away from any settlements. That night they made a cold camp in a stand of dense pines. No fire, the smoke would be visible for miles. They ate dried meat and huddled under their blankets, listening to the sounds of the winter forest. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries lonely and wild. How many days to Fort Laramie at this pace? Rhain asked quietly. 3 weeks? Maybe 4 if the weather turns. And how many days before Gaines figures out we're coming? Hard to say. Depends on whether anyone spotted us leaving, whether word travels. Could be days, could be weeks, or could be he already knows. Sennie didn't answer. It was a possibility they both understood. Gaines hadn't survived this long by being careless. He had resources, connections, men who owed him favors or feared his wrath. If he'd heard about a stranger asking questions, a man matching Rhain's description, he might have already sent men to investigate. They took turns keeping watch through the long night. When dawn came, grey and cold, they were both exhausted but alive. They moved on. The days fell into a rhythm. Walk from dawn to dusk, covering as many miles as the terrain allowed. Make cold camps, eat cold food, sleep in shifts. Speak little, conserve energy. The landscape rolled past them. Mountains and valleys, frozen streams and silent forests. They saw no one, which was both reassuring and unnerving. In country this remote you could disappear and never be found. On the 5th day they reached Dry Ridge. Sennie knew it immediately, even though she'd never been here before. The distinctive rock formation Rhain had described, the narrow trail winding between steep slopes. This was where Beau had died, where 3 men had been ambushed and murdered for trying to do the right thing. Rhain stopped at the entrance to the narrow section, his face pale. "This is it," he said quietly. Sennie dismounted and walked forward slowly. The snow here was undisturbed, peaceful. No sign remained of what had happened 3 years ago. But she could picture it, Bo riding through this passage, alert but hopeful. He was almost done, almost to safety. Just had to make it through this last stretch, then the shots, the surprise, the falling. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it settle on her. This ground had soaked up her brother's blood. This place had been the last thing he saw. When she opened her eyes, Rhain was standing a little ways off, near a cluster of rocks. He was looking at something, his expression tortured. She walked over and saw what he was seeing, a rough wooden cross, weathered but still standing, half buried in snow. "You made this?" she asked. He nodded. "After I left the army, I came back here and marked the spot. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I couldn't leave it unmarked. Couldn't let there be nothing." Sennie knelt beside the cross, brushing snow from it. The wood was simple pine, but someone had carved it with care. She touched it gently, thinking of Bo's grave behind her cabin with its matching marker. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. They stood there together for a long moment, two people bound by grief and purpose. Then Sennie straightened her shoulders. "Let's keep moving. We're not far from the old military route. That's where it gets dangerous." They traveled on, leaving Dry Ridge behind. But something had shifted between them. They'd both seen the place where everything had gone wrong, had stood together on ground made sacred by sacrifice. It created a connection neither of them had expected. That evening, camped in a cave they'd found in a hillside, Rhain broke the silence. "What will you do after this is over?" Sennie was surprised by the question. She'd been so focused on the journey, on getting to Fort Laramie, that she hadn't thought about what came after. "Go home, I suppose. Back to my cabin, my traplines. Same as before. Will it be the same, though? After all this?" She considered that. "No, I don't suppose it will be. But I don't know what else to do. That's my home. My place. You could do anything. Go anywhere. You're resourceful, skilled. You could start over somewhere new. I'm 42 years old. Too old to start over. That's not old. You've got half your life ahead of you." She looked at him in the firelight. They'd risked a small fire in the cave, the smoke dispersing among the rocks. "What about you? What will you do?" "Depends on what happens with Gaines. If we succeed, I'll testify. Stay as long as they need me. After that," he shrugged, "I don't know. I've spent 3 years searching for your family. Haven't thought much beyond that. You could disappear. Change your name, move somewhere no one knows you. Start fresh, maybe, but running doesn't change what I did. Doesn't let me sleep at night, does anything? Not yet. But maybe finishing this will help." They were quiet for a while, watching the small flames flicker. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning through the rocks like something lost and searching. "I need to tell you something," Rhain said suddenly. "In case we don't make it. In case something happens." Sennie tensed. "What?" "I don't regret finding you. I know that sounds strange given everything. But these past weeks, working with you, planning this journey, trying to finish what Bo started, it's the first time in 3 years I've felt like I'm doing something worthwhile. Like maybe I'm not completely beyond redemption." She didn't know what to say to that. Part of her wanted to tell him he was beyond redemption, that nothing would ever make up for killing Bo. But another part, the part that had watched him carry his guilt like a millstone, that had seen his determination to make things right, that part understood what he meant. "Bo would have liked you," she said finally. "If you'd met under different circumstances. You're the kind of man he respected, someone trying to do right even when it's hard. That means more than you know." They settled in for the night, taking turns at watch as always. But sleep was hard to come by. They were getting close now to territory where Gaines might have men posted, close to where their journey could end badly. The next morning brought a change in weather. Clouds rolled in thick and low, and by midday it was snowing again. Not a blizzard, but steady, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. They pushed on, moving more slowly, alert for any signs of danger. It was Sennie who spotted the tracks. Fresh horse prints in the new snow, heading in the same direction they were traveling. 3 riders moving fast. She and Rhain exchanged glances. It could be innocent, trappers, traders, anyone with business in the territory. But the timing was suspicious, and they couldn't afford to take chances. "We need to know who they are," Sennie said, "and whether they're looking for us." They followed the tracks carefully, staying far enough back to avoid being spotted. The riders were pushing hard, not bothering to cover their trail. That suggested either confidence or urgency. Neither was reassuring. By late afternoon they caught up. The three men had stopped to rest their horses in a sheltered spot. Sennie and Rhain crept close enough to observe, hidden in the trees. The men wore no uniforms, but they had the bearing of soldiers or lawmen. Odd-faced men who sat their horses with easy confidence. And when one of them spoke, his voice carried in the cold air. "Tollis has to be heading for Fort Laramie. Only place that makes sense. We find him before he gets there. Gaines doubles our pay." Sennie's blood ran cold. Rhain's face went hard as stone. The second man spoke up. "What about the woman? She with him?" "Probably. Orders are clear, no witnesses. We take them both down, bring back anything they're carrying, especially any papers or documents." The third man laughed, a sound without humor. 3 years Tollis has been sniffing around. Should have killed him when we had the chance. Well, we got the chance now. Come on, let's keep moving. They can't be more than a day ahead. The three men mounted up and rode on, unaware they were being watched. Sennie and Rhain stayed hidden until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then carefully backed away. When they were far enough to risk speaking, Rhain let out a slow breath. "They're ahead of us now, between us and Fort Laramie, and looking for us." Sennie's mind raced. "We could go around them. Take a longer route. They'll be watching all the approaches. Gaines wouldn't send just 3 men. There will be others posted at key points." "Then what do we do?" Rhain was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When he spoke, his voice was steady and certain. "We use what we know. We're mountain people, both of us. We know how to move through country like this, how to use terrain to our advantage. They're looking for us on the trails, at the obvious crossing points. So we go where they won't expect. Through the high passes, the hard country. It'll be slower, more dangerous. But it's our best chance." Sennie nodded slowly. It was a sound plan, though it would push them to their limits. The high passes in winter were treacherous, exposed to weather, and steep enough to kill if you made one wrong step. But Rhain was right. Gaines' men would never expect them to go that way. "We'll need to move fast," she said, "before they realize we're not coming through the lowlands, and we'll need to be ready to fight if they catch us anyway." She met his eyes. "Are you ready for that? To kill men who are following orders, just like you were? These men know exactly what they're doing. They're killers, not soldiers. And yes, I'm ready to stop them if it means Beau's evidence reaches Fort Laramie." Sennie studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Then let's go. We've got a lot of ground to cover and not much time." They turned north, away from the route Gaines' men were watching, and began climbing toward the high country. The snow fell steadily, covering their tracks almost as fast as they made them. With luck, by the time anyone realized they'd changed course, it would be too late. But luck, Sennie knew from hard experience, was a fickle companion in the mountains. All they could do was push forward and hope they reached Fort Laramie before Gaines's men realized where they'd gone. The high pass was everything Sennie had feared, and worse. The wind up here was relentless, driving snow into their faces until they could barely see. The trail, if you could call it that, was barely wide enough for one person, with steep drops on either side that disappeared into white nothing. One wrong step would mean a fall that ended only when you hit rocks far below. They moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing their weight. Rhain went first, Sennie close behind. They'd roped themselves together so if one fell, the other might have a chance to catch them. In reality, a fall would probably take them both down. It took them 2 days to cross that pass. 2 days of pushing through wind and snow and cold so intense it felt like knives against exposed skin. They didn't dare make camp. The wind would have torn any shelter apart. So they kept moving, stopping only for brief rests huddled against rock faces, eating frozen meat with hands so numb they could barely hold it. On the second night, as they finally descended below the worst of the wind, Sennie's legs simply gave out. She sat down hard in the snow, her body shaking with exhaustion. Rhain came back to her, his face grey with cold and fatigue. "Can you keep going?" She wanted to say yes, but her body had other ideas. "Need to rest. Just for a while." They found a spot sheltered by an overhang and collapsed there. Rhain got a small fire going somehow, his hands shaking as he worked. The warmth felt like a miracle. They huddled close to it, too tired to even eat. "We made it through," Rhain said after a while. "The worst is behind us now." Sennie nodded, unable to speak. Every muscle in her body screamed. But they'd done it. They'd crossed terrain that Gaines' men would never expect, would probably never attempt. That bought them time, bought them a chance. By morning they were moving again, descending into more sheltered country. The temperature was still brutal, but at least the wind had died down. They could see where they were going, could plan more than one step at a time. 2 days later, they saw riders in the distance. They were following a ridgeline when Rhain spotted them, 3 men on horseback, moving along a parallel valley. Too far away to identify, but moving with purpose, searching. "More of Gaines's men," Rhain said quietly. "How did they know we'd come this way?" "They didn't. They're probably searching everywhere, covering all the routes. Gaines has the resources to put men all over this territory." They watched the riders disappear into the trees, then carefully made their way down the opposite side of the ridge. They'd have to be more cautious now. The closer they got to Fort Laramie, the more men Gaines would have watching. That evening, camped in a dense thicket, they studied Sennie's map by firelight. "We're close," Rhain said, pointing. "Another 4 days, maybe 5. Then we're within reach of the fort, and within reach of anyone waiting for us." "Yes," he looked at her seriously. "This is where it gets most dangerous, the last stretch. They'll be watching the approaches to the fort, all the main routes. We'll have to be smart, move carefully." Sennie touched the pack where Beau's journal copies rested, safe and dry. They'd come so far, endured so much. The thought of failing now, of being stopped when they were this close, was unbearable. "We split up," she said suddenly. "What?" "We split up. Take different routes to the fort. If one of us is caught, the other might still make it through." Rhain shook his head. "No, we're stronger together. We watch each other's backs, and if they catch us both. If we lose everything Beau died for, we won't." "You don't know that." He met her eyes across the fire. "You're right, I don't. But I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We started this together. We finish it together." She wanted to argue, but the determination in his face stopped her. And truthfully, part of her was grateful. The thought of making this last push alone, of walking into danger with no one watching her back, filled her with dread. "Together then," she said. They moved out before dawn, using the pre-light hours to cover ground while remaining harder to spot. The terrain here was more settled. They passed abandoned homesteads, old trap lines, signs of human presence. They had to be more careful now, staying to cover, avoiding open ground. At midday, as they crossed a frozen stream, Sennie spotted something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow at the water's edge. Boot prints, several sets, no more than an hour old. And they were heading in the same direction. She and Rhain exchanged glances. Then, moving in unison, born of days traveling together, they melted back into the trees and began to follow the tracks. They needed to know who these men were and whether they stood between them and Fort Laramie. The tracks led them through thick timber to a clearing, and there, around a small fire, sat 3 men. The same 3 they'd seen days before, the ones who'd spoken of hunting them for Gaines. One of them was studying a map, the others checking their weapons. As Sennie and Rhain watched from concealment, the man with the map spoke. "Tollis has to come through here. It's the only route that makes sense now. We set up here, wait for him to show, then take him down." The second man grunted. "And the woman?" "Her too." Gaines was clear, no witnesses. The third man stood stretching. "I'm going to scout the north approach. Make sure there's no other way around." He walked directly toward where Sennie and Rhain were hidden. Sennie's hand moved to Beau's hunting knife at her belt. Beside her, Rhain had his revolver drawn, hammer back. The man was 20 feet away and closing, his eyes scanning the tree line, but not yet seeing them. 15 feet. 10. Sennie could hear his breathing now, see the frost on his beard. Her fingers tightened on the knife handle. If he spotted them, if he called out, they'd have all 3 men on them in seconds. They'd have to fight or run, and either way their chance of reaching Fort Laramie would drop to nearly nothing. 5 feet. The man stopped, tilted his head, listening. Had he heard something? Sensed their presence? Sennie held perfectly still, barely breathing. Then he turned and walked back toward the fire, calling out, "Nothing on this side. Trees are too thick. Nobody's coming through here?" Sennie released her breath slowly. Beside her, Rhain eased the hammer down on his revolver. They'd been seconds from discovery, from a fight that could have ended everything. They backed away carefully, not making a sound, until they were far enough to risk movement. Then they circled wide around the clearing, giving the 3 men a berth of nearly a mile. "That was close," Rhain whispered when they finally stopped. "Too close." Sennie's heart was still pounding. "They're set up right where we need to go. We'll have to find another way around, or go through them." She looked at him sharply. 3 against 2? Poor odds. Better than you think. They're expecting us to walk into their trap. They're not expecting us to come at them deliberately." He checked his revolver, counted his remaining ammunition. "And I was a sharpshooter, remember? I can take 1, maybe 2, before they know what's happening. That evens the odds considerably." Sennie didn't like it, but she couldn't see another option. Going around would add days to their journey, days they didn't have. And there would just be more of Gaines' men ahead, more ambushes to avoid or fight through. "We do this smart," she said. "No unnecessary killing. We disable them, take their weapons, leave them unable to follow. And if they don't give us that option," she met his eyes, "then we do what we have to do. Beau's evidence reaches Fort Laramie. That's all that matters." They spent the rest of the day planning and positioning themselves. Sennie circled around to the north, the direction the men weren't watching as carefully. Rhain took position in the rocks above the clearing, where he'd have a clear field of fire. They'd wait until evening, when the fading light would work in their favor. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink, Sennie made her move. She walked deliberately toward the clearing, making just enough noise to be heard, but not so much as to seem suspicious. A lone traveler, tired, looking for shelter, one of the men heard her and stood, hand moving to his weapon. "Who's there?" Sennie stepped into view, her rifle slung over her shoulder in a non-threatening manner. "Just passing through. Saw your fire. Wondered if you'd share it for a spell. It's been a cold day." The 3 men exchanged glances. They saw a woman alone, seemingly harmless. Their guard dropped slightly. "Sure, come on in," the leader said, though his eyes were calculating. "You travel alone out here?" "I do. Been doing it for years." Sennie walked closer, every sense alert. "You boys heading to Fort Laramie?" "Might be. You?" "Eventually." She was 10 feet from them now, close enough to see their faces clearly, to read their intentions. "Say, you haven't seen another traveler, have you? Man by himself, maybe wounded?" That got their attention. The leader's hand moved closer to his gun. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm not alone," Sennie said, and dove sideways as Rhain's first shot rang out. The leader went down, clutching his shoulder. Rhain's second shot took the gun from another man's hand before he could draw. The 3rd man got his weapon up, but Sennie was on him, Beau's knife flashing in the dying light. She knocked the gun aside and pressed the blade to his throat. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make me kill you." The man froze. Behind him, his companions were down, one wounded, one disarmed, both stunned by the sudden reversal. Rhain emerged from his position, rifle trained on the group. Weapons on the ground, all of them, slow and easy. They complied, knowing they were beaten. Sennie collected their guns while Rhain kept them covered. The leader glared at them, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. "Gaines will kill you for this," he spat. "Gaines is going to have bigger problems than us," Rhain replied. "Tell him that when you see him. Tell him Beau Darrow's evidence is going to Fort Laramie, and there's nothing he can do to stop it." They tied the men securely, took their ammunition and supplies, and left them there. By the time they worked free or someone found them, Sennie and Rhain would be long gone. They walked through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Gaines's men. When dawn came, Fort Laramie was visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings against the rising sun, the American flag flying above them. They'd made it. Against all odds, through winter and danger, and men intent on killing them, they'd reached their destination. Sennie looked at Rhain, saw the same exhausted relief in his face that she felt. They'd done it! They'd finished what Bo started. Now came the final test, convincing Major Kinsman to listen, to act, to bring down a territorial judge and expose years of corruption. But they'd crossed mountains and survived ambushes. They'd faced this last challenge together. Major Daniel Kinsman was a tall man with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much war to be easily fooled. He sat behind his desk at Fort Laramie, studying the documents spread before him with an expression that shifted from skepticism to disbelief to cold fury as he read. Sennie and Rhain sat across from him, exhausted from their journey but alert. They'd been here for 2 hours now, telling their story, presenting Bo's journal and the documents Rhain had preserved. Kinsman had listened without interrupting, reading every page carefully. Finally, he looked up. He stopped, searching for words. This is one of the most damning pieces of evidence I've ever seen. The scope of it, the years of theft, the murder to cover it up. His jaw tightened. And you're telling me Colonel Gaines, now Judge Gaines, ordered the assassination of 3 men to keep this quiet? Yes, sir, Rhain said. I was there. I fired the shots on his orders, not knowing what I was really doing. But he knew. He ordered their deaths to protect himself and his network. Kinsman studied Rhain with those sharp eyes. You're confessing to murder. I am. I'll stand trial if necessary. But first I want to see Gaines answer for what he did. The Major turned to Sennie. And you, Miss Darrow, your brother was one of the men killed. He was. He spent months gathering this evidence, knowing it might cost him his life. He died trying to do the right thing. I want his sacrifice to mean something. Kinsman nodded slowly. It will, I promise you that. This evidence is solid. Signatures, dates, witness statements, everything we need. I'll send word to the Department of the Army immediately. Gaines will be arrested, tried for treason, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Everyone in his network will be investigated. He has powerful friends, Sennie warned. He'll fight this. Let him fight. The truth is on our side now, thanks to your brother's courage and your determination to see this through. Kinsman stood, offering his hand first to Sennie, then to Rhain. You've done a brave thing, both of you. The army, the country, owes you a debt. Word traveled fast. Within 3 days, federal marshals had arrested Gaines in Cheyenne. His protests and claims of innocence meant nothing against the weight of evidence. Other arrests followed. Officers, suppliers, middlemen who'd profited from the stolen goods. The network Bo had worked so hard to expose collapsed like a house of cards. The trial took place that spring. Sennie and Rhain both testified, along with soldiers who'd witnessed the thefts, widows of men who'd died from lack of supplies, and records clerks who'd been told to look the other way. Gaines' lawyers tried to discredit the evidence, but Bo's journal was too detailed, too carefully documented. And Rhain's testimony, given with painful honesty about his own role, carried the weight of genuine remorse. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. Gaines was sentenced to hang for treason and murder. His co-conspirators received lesser sentences, but their careers and reputations were destroyed. Justice finally for Bo Darrow and the countless others who'd suffered from their greed. It was late May when Sennie finally returned to her cabin. The snow had melted, revealing a world of green and growing things. Wildflowers dotted the meadow, and the sound of running water filled the air. She stood for a long moment, just looking at her home, feeling something shift inside her. Rhain was with her. After the trial, he'd been offered clemency in recognition of his cooperation and his 3 years of trying to make amends. He'd accepted gratefully, then asked Sennie where she was heading. When she'd said home, he'd asked if she minded company for the journey. She hadn't. They'd talked a lot on the way back about the past and the future, about guilt and forgiveness and whether people could truly change. Sennie still didn't have all the answers, might never have them. But she knew this. Rhain had helped her finish what Bo started. He'd risked his life to bring a corrupt man to justice, and he'd given her something she hadn't had in 3 years, companionship. She wouldn't call it forgiveness. Maybe she'd never fully forgive him for pulling the trigger that killed her brother. But she understood him now, understood the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. And that was something. They visited Beau's grave together that first evening back. Sennie told her brother about the trial, about Gain's conviction, about how his courage had finally been recognized. She placed fresh wildflowers on the marker and stood there in the fading light, feeling at peace for the first time in years. That night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin, Rhain spoke quietly. "I'll leave tomorrow if you want. Head out, find somewhere new to settle." Sennie looked at him across the flames. She thought about the long winter ahead, about the silence that would fill the cabin when he was gone. She thought about Beau and what he would have wanted for her, not a life of lonely grief, but a life lived fully, with compassion and hope. "Stay," she said, "through the summer at least. There's work to be done around here, and—" She paused. "And I could use the company." His expression shifted, relief and gratitude mixing together. "I'd like that." On the mantel, Beau's pocket watch ticked steadily, marking time that was no longer frozen. 3:47 had passed hours ago, days ago, would pass again tomorrow. But it wasn't the end anymore. It was just a moment in time, one moment among many. Sennie walked to the window and looked out at the mountains, their peaks still white with snow even in spring. Somewhere out there justice had been served. Her brother's death had not been in vain. And she was no longer frozen in grief, no longer alone in her mourning. She turned back to the warm cabin, to the fire crackling in the hearth, and the quiet companionship of someone who understood loss and redemption. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges. But tonight there was peace, and that was enough.